Hello, and welcome to Sinister Creations. I'm Jack, you might know me as randomsyhn from Instagram. I made these nifty Scorpia claws for the new She-Ra, and a lot of you have been asking how I did it. So I've put together this video to kind of show you my practices and methods. Some of them may work for you, some of them may fail epically, but we're going to find out. This tutorial can be used for any type of clawed cosplay you may have on back burner. You could do him from Powerpuff Girls. You could be Zoidberg. You could be Mr. Krabs. The possibilities are endless. So, let's get started. All right, start off with, we're going to go over materials. First up, EVA foam, contact cement, heat gun, sandpaper, exacto knives, protection, scissors and tape, and then PVC pipe. You're going to want to make sure that you have 2 gauges of PVC pipe and one of them fits nicely into the other. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to make the hinge that makes the claws go clack clack. And the materials not depicted here: sewing pins, glue gun, screws, 2-way stretch fabric and something to sew with, as well as a desire to hug all kitties. Next up, let's talk about the pattern. You are going to need one. I have put one together. It's up on my Gumroad. If you'd like, you can go buy that there, but you absolutely do not have to. I will show you the shapes that I am using. You can draw them out yourself on poster board and use them to make your claws. You may have to fiddle with measurements a little bit, but that's another option. So here are the shapes that I am using, as you can see before you. In the top corner, I'm going over which shape goes where on the final pattern. If you look at 6, 7, and 8, those are the spikes on the claws. If you have foam clay and prefer to sculpt those out, you are more than welcome to do that on your own. I will show you how I did them with cutouts of foam, with cutting and sanding. But again, there's always more than one way to do anything, and if you find a better way to do any of this, I would love to know. This is not the end-all be-all way to make these Scorpia claws. This is the way I made them. Still on the pattern, you are going to have to size this pattern properly to make sure that these claws fit you the best they can. Whether you're using my pattern or drawing out your own, you're going to have to scale them properly. To do this, you're going to take piece number 1 from the pattern, lay it down, and then lay your arm on top of it like so. As you can see, the elbow is not within the pattern and your wrist and hand are kind of in the center. This is very deliberately so that when you bend your arm, the back of the claw isn't going to poke into you, and also because in the center of the claw is where the mechanism is going to go. If you make it too big, you won't have any range of motion, and if you make it too small, it might look a little funny. Now you're going to want to trace out your pattern onto the foam. So for piece 1, you're going to want to make 2 sections of foam. You're going to want to make sure that you flip the pattern before drawing the second one, just so you don't have that space marine texture on the outside of your claw. Unless that's your thing. So I'm not really following any numerical order with how I'm drawing these out. I'm trying to draw them so I have the least wasted foam possible. Next up, we're doing piece number 5 from the pattern. You're going to want to make 3 foam pieces out of that. Again, making sure you flip the pattern for at least one of those to avoid having that texture on the outside. You should be able to fit all of the pattern pieces for a single claw into one of these foam puzzle pieces, depending on how you size it. If you make it a whole lot bigger than what I've provided, you may have to do a little creative maneuvering. Otherwise, they should all fit. So for pieces 2, 3, and 4, you're only going to have to make 1 foam piece of any of these. That is for making a single claw. I'm just describing things to make a single claw. I am making 2 in this video. It's just a little easier to talk about in the sense of 1 claw at a time. So lastly, we've got pieces 6, 7, and 8. Those are the spikes. As I said, if you have foam clay, you can just neglect these all together. Or if you want to carve them out of foam like I have, you'll need 2 pieces, 1 flipped for piece 6. You're going to need 4 pieces, 2 flipped for piece 7, and you're going to need 8 pieces, 4 flipped for piece 8. Once you have everything patterned out, it is time to start cutting. Make sure your blade is sharp, whether it's a crafting knife, exacto blade, whatever you're using. Unless there are some serrated blades that are really nice. They're harder to actually cut yourself with, but they cut the foam really nice and they don't need sharpening. So that's also an option too. Don't be as foolish as me. As you can see by the taped up thumb, I have donated my blood to the cosplay gods, for they demand their sacrifice. No, but seriously, please don't cut yourself. Be very careful. Make sure your fingers are out of the way when you are slicing. Mostly because then you will slice part of your finger off. It's not fun. I don't recommend it. Don't do it. Once we have all our pieces cut out, it is time to shape them. So get out your heat guns. I also have some acrylic domes, which are really nice for shaping things. You don't need them. Your knee works fine. Just make sure you're wearing some pants and not shorts, because hot foam is not fun. We're only really going to have to do any real shaping on pieces 1, 2, 3, and 4. Everything else we're actually gluing into blocks and basically carving out the shape we want. So these are the only ones that we're going to have to heat up and then try to get those complex curves. As you can see how I am doing it in the video. It's kind of hard to describe. You just need to play with the foam, hold it for it to cool a little bit into the shape that you want. And if it's not the shape that you want, you just heat it back up and try again. Usually there's a lot of stretching, tugging, I am trying to make sure that kind of wrist area of the claw is the most curved, and this will help later on, especially with the gluing. So another thing I do while I'm shaping everything is I actually pin the pattern together into the final result. So I want to see what my claw is going to look like. I like to do this because this helps me make sure I've shaped it the way I want. It makes sure that the pattern works and I don't have to go back and change anything. It's also a way to try it on. Be careful though, it is stuck with pins, and if you rip your arm out too quickly, you may be losing a few chunks of flesh. Again, we already gave the gods their sacrifice. No more. Now, looking at our pre-pinned piece, the edges are really chunky. They don't come together smoothly. For the moment, that's fine. We're just trying to make sure that the shape is working, and we're also still kind of shaping it, heating it up and working it while it's all pinned together. As you can see in this next shot, I'm actually slicing those edges on that curve of piece number 1. So a bevel is cutting the edge on an angle, and this is going to make sure that the two pieces come together a lot nicer. You're going to have to do this on everyone, and just make sure that the bevel is kind of like as shown above, that the rough side will have more cut away, if that makes any sense. So it's a good idea to sand this down as well. If you're like me, you've got a lot of those little edges that the cuts aren't quite clean. It's also it's going to help with the glue adhere. Since it's a contact cement, you want more surface area to touch more surface area, and those ridges are going to cause problems. I've used hand sanding here, as you can see in the video. I also did use my sanding belts. Before we get to the gluing, there's one thing I'd like to mention. So I didn't do this, and if I were to make these again, I would. You take your pattern piece 1, and you will sand down the inner edge as shown here with the textured side. Just the reason is we're going to be gluing stuff to that area, and it just sticks a lot better when you've had that sanded down. There's none of that coating they seem to have on it. It's a little more porous, so it absorbs the glue a bit better, and there's just more surface area to touch the pieces. As you'll see, I'm touching up my glue job as I go, and it's just simply because I didn't do something like that, and this would have made my life so much easier. Now we get to start my favorite part. It's the gluing. I like it because this is where everything kind of comes together. You finally get to see your piece as a 3D piece, and the pins aren't poking you when you try it on. It's the best. It's the best. My favorite part. We're going to start with that part we beveled on piece 1. So that curved edge there. We're going to put glue on both sides, so of both pieces. Let that glue sit for a little bit. If you're using contact cement, you need to wait just a little bit, let it cure a bit. You want it to go from basically glossy to matte, but just barely. It should be tacky, but not liquidy, if that makes sense. Once you hit that tacky consistency, make sure you're very careful as you join your two pieces together. I like to hold them there for a little bit just to make sure that glue has a chance to really hold. And then you set it down and leave it for a few seconds while you grab the next piece to coat with glue. Now we grab piece 2. We're going to pick one side and one side of the inner edge of piece 1. So we coat those, the matching ones, so top of the triangle to the tip of the claw, and we make sure that we glue that perpendicular to each other. If you don't know what that means, I have a little diagram here that shows you how it's going to be glued together. While I'm doing all of these big pieces, I'm also coating the pattern side, the rough side, the Space Marine side, whatever you want to call it, of all the claws. So of our pattern 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we're making sure that we're putting it on both sides, letting it get tacky, and then sticking them together. You can sand the texture down like is suggested for those inner edges of piece 1, but there's enough surface area, the claws and the spikes are big enough that it's not really a huge issue. Once the first side of piece 2 has dried, you glue it to the second side, and then you grab piece 3. I like to do the top edge that connects to piece 2 and then the edge that connects to one of the piece 1s at the same time, so we make sure when we're actually putting everything together, once the glue has gone tacky, right corner to corner, basically. Everything is still perpendicular. That top edge is perpendicular to piece 2. The other edge is perpendicular to piece 1. And you glue that together. Once that's together, again, you do the other side the same way. So for piece 4, it's our top edge of our claw. So we're going to be gluing it to piece 1, as shown up in the top corner. It's not going to be perpendicular like the other pieces were. It's going to be edge to edge. So there's a little diagram of what that looks like. You're going to have to make sure you do have some curl in both the top edge of piece 1 and in piece 4. If you have to go back with the heat gun and do a little bit more curling, do it. It'll help you in the long run, and it'll save you a lot on sanding and filling. So I taped these down because they didn't like staying. Even with the contact cement, it does take a little bit of time to properly set. So I taped them down just to keep them there a little bit better. Now that the glue has dried, we can get into shaping everything. This part generally requires a lot of sanding for me personally, because I'm not all that neat with my edges. I will start out by cutting them. You can see there I'm using the scissors and using the knife to just kind of shape it a little bit, get those edges down. The better you do with that carving process, the less sanding you'll have to do. I use a sanding belt, so I'm not super concerned, and I like to use it excessively. If you don't have access to a sanding belt, I highly recommend spending a little extra time with that carving, the part with the scissors and the knife, just to really round those edges before you go at them with sandpaper. That's what we're doing basically, is rounding off the edges. With the spikes, you want to make sure they go to a point. So I like to roll them on the sanding belt, or again, use the scissors. They actually work really great. If you have a good pair of scissors and you're just cutting to that tip, you can get a pretty cool shape, and then you just sand it smooth, which is really nice. Once you're done with your sanding, we go to filling. So despite how well you do, you will probably have cracks and edges. I like to fill these, again, foam clay is great for this. If you fill those edges and then you go back over them with hand sanding, not with the sanding belt, it'll just get rid of it. It will take it off. So here's me just filling with foam. If you don't have foam clay, you can use wood glue. Sometimes if you have a lot of foam dust left over and you mix that with the wood glue, it kind of makes a nice filler. Wood filler actually itself is also pretty handy, so that's an option you could use. If you only have like school glue, foam dust again, and it'll give you a filler basically, which works really nice. If you're really patient, you could just layer that glue until you have that nice and full, sand it down by hand. Anything after you've put this on has to be done by hand. If you try to do this with a sanding belt or a Dremel, you're just going to strip whatever filler you've put in. I know, I've done it. It's not fun. Now that we've got all the foam finished the way we want, it's time to work on the hinge. This is going to make the claws go clack clack. We're going to start out by getting our 2 gauges of PVC pipe. Again, one needs to fit snugly into the other. We're going to take the larger gauge and then we're going to measure it, basically against the width of piece 2. You can make it a little bigger, a little smaller. We're going to be cutting out a hole for it, but you don't want it longer than the whole claw. Once you've cut that larger piece of PVC, you want to cut the smaller one to the same width or slightly smaller. Next, we're going to be actually cutting out a section of the larger piece of PVC pipe. This is so the hinge has room to move. At the bottom of the screen, you're going to see a diagram of what I have cut out, the kind of section that I have done. So this is what you want to cut out. I'm using a crafting knife. If you have a Dremel tool with a cutting attachment, please use that. It's a lot safer. I didn't think of it until afterwards, and I'm kind of kicking myself because I spent so much time being very careful with that cutting tool and not chopping off a finger. Especially because the PVC pipe, it's very hard to get through, but once you do, it slices rather smoothly, so you need to make sure all fingers are out of the way. Now, depending on how you want to do this, you can just take that second piece of PVC pipe, put it in the first, and glue it to the bottom of your claw. I'd score it, and I wouldn't use a contact cement. The PVC is a little too smooth, so the scoring is to make it a little less smooth, and then I used a silicone glue, maybe a crazy glue or something that might hold a little bit better. Because I didn't trust the hold of glue, I did add a few screws in. So what I did is I drilled a hole in that smaller PVC pipe with my Dremel tool. I drilled a large one that will allow for the head of my screws to go through, and I drilled a smaller one directly across from it that will only allow the tip of the screw to go through. So then I place that smaller piece of PVC pipe within the larger piece of PVC pipe and then stick the screws in. Unfortunately, you can't stick the screws in first. It's not going to work. Once you do that, it moves rather nicely. I put foam in to kind of block the screws from coming back out, and I glued it with hot glue. So I kind of sealed it up and made sure the screws stayed in place. I then poked a couple holes into the claw piece, so piece 5, if that everyone's still going with the numbers. That would fit nicely with the screws, and then once you attach that together, it flows back and forth rather easily. I would not glue that piece onto the... I would not glue piece 5 onto the hinge quite yet, because you do want to paint things before you glue them all together. It's just going to make it easier and your glue doesn't mess up your mechanism. So next what we're going to have to do is actually make a hole for the hinge and the claw. So what we're going to start is we're going to take the hinge, we're going to put it on our claw, the whole big piece. We're going to trace it out, and you can cut it out with your knife. Again, make sure you have a sharp knife. Then, once it fits nice and snugly, we are going to actually make a T-shaped cut. This T-shape is going to allow for the base of piece 5 to kind of fall through a little bit. You're going to get a nice closer hinge reaction, and it just works really nicely. So make that big enough for that to fit through. Now you need a handle, something to actually control the claw's movement forward and backwards. So I've added this to the pattern. There is just a tiny T-shape that I make out of foam and glue that to the higher edge of piece 5, where the screw holes, or where you glue it to the hinge, is the lower edge. Now it's time to add the spikes. The configuration I use, as you can see below you, before you, is the biggest spike is on the back. The second biggest spike is centered at the front of that spike, just a little bit above center of the sides. And then on either side of that, there's the smallest spike. This is the design I came up with. You guys can do whatever you like. If you're using the foam clay rather than making the spikes, there's endless possibilities. You can add as many or as few as you want, and it'll look awesome. I'll also take whatever filler I've provided and go around the bottom edge of those spikes, just because sometimes they don't lie flush, and it's kind of nice to smooth that out and make it more as part of the actual piece instead of like a separate part sticking off. So once all of that is done, you should have something that looks kind of like this. And through the power of editing and possibly having another pair already ready to go, your claws will look like this after priming and painting. I tend to prime with Plasti Dip. This tends to smooth down those edges even better. I put on a couple of coats of that. It also is better for the paint to adhere to. This is the first time I did get to play with my new airbrush, so that's kind of what you see with the black tips. You can paint it however you want. I didn't record the painting of it. I didn't know if anybody wanted to see that. If you do, I still do have the newer claws unpainted, so we could do that. Let me know. I have also added a piece of fabric around the clackety-clack piece of the claw just to hide the hinge. I glued that down with hot glue. It's pretty straightforward. There is a piece of the pattern. I cut it out, glued it to the edge of the claw. Once I glued in the hinge, I glued it around the hinge so it would cover it. I did have to widen that T-shaped hole I made just to allow for the fabric to go in with the claw, but otherwise I find it's a nice way to kind of hide any of the messiness of that hinge. So I have included the fabric piece in my pattern on Gumroad. And so this fabric, it's basically a tube. You just glue the edges to the top of the claw, and then you make sure there's just enough give when you glue the edges to the bottom. Yeah, I just find it adds a little bit of finish to the claw, makes it look a little neater, hides the mechanism. You don't have to. It's entirely optional. If you'd rather just paint the hinge red, like, go nuts. Just make sure if you do paint it, it's not obstructing your movement. Alright guys, that's it for today's Force Captain orientation. You now know how to make a pair of awesome Scorpia Claws. I hope you like this. This was my first cosplay video, so if you want to see more, let me know what you want to see, and I will give it my best try. If you liked it, let me know. If there's things I could do better, let me know. I know. I definitely know. So I guess that's it for today, guys. Have fun. Stay safe. And Scorpia hugs for all.